Hello everyone, it's me again. Your hands will soon get tired. So, welcome back, and this is a solo session, and I think we will turn back in it a little bit more towards literature, but politics is inevitably never far away, and I'm sure will be present too. And this is another writer whose work I've known for a long time now, and that has amazed me by its intensity, its variety, its capabilities, its quantities. He is a writer of amazing range and scope. He's also a walker. He's also a sailor, or at least a person who goes on boats. And we'll hear a little about that to come. He was, for a long time, a producer of radio, and still is now a maker and still a maker of many kinds of radio. And I think that auditory attention is very evident in his writing. I'm not going to do long introductions because you're going to hear from the person himself, and that's who you want to hear from, and because it's written down for you. But I just wanted to get to that idea of a very careful ear, because I was going to start by asking Horatio to read arguably the first paragraph, not that you ever wrote, but that you ever wrote that got published from your first book. And I wonder if you could just set the scene a little for the writing of that, and then let us hear it. You can read more than one paragraph if you want.
Thanks, Rob. And thank you for having me, and thank you, British Council, for having me, and thank you, all of you, for turning up after lunch. I hugely appreciate it. A lot of the reading out loud that I do now is to my son at bedtime, and at first I realised I wasn't trying to entertain, I was trying to put him to sleep. So if anyone drops off, I'll take it as a compliment. If I drop off, it's a problem. So this, Rob just sort of sprung this on me, is Running for the Hills, which was my first book. And I wrote it to find out. I think most of my writing is about finding out. And I grew up a mountain in Wales in extreme beauty and poverty, and often in fear, but surrounded by wonder and the fecundity of nature, which was constantly present. So if you've got mice behind the wallpaper stopping you going to sleep, and when you go down to breakfast, there's another one eating lentils behind the Weetabix every morning, you've got a choice, really, which is sort of shoot it or name it. And because shooting things was prohibited, my mother is a political person that she believes in live and let live, which is her great creed. And one of the reasons I thought the book worth writing, because it seemed to me very important. So we called it Vivian, and we made friends with it, and that's more or less how I grew up. And we didn't have television. And we were cut off in winter, so it was proper. And I've become a celebrant, I think. And the theme of this talk, if there is one, is sort of radical optimism. Because when you're poor and frightened, as we often were, you can cower down, which in some ways is my natural reaction. But we were taught to live it as if it were a grand adventure. And we saw no distinction between the adventures that took place in books and the characters of the animals all around us, and the life that we were living. And so then I went off to work at the BBC eventually, and I saw a lot of great writers through the glass, and I had the wonderful power of being able to pick up the telephone and say the magic BBC, and they would say yes. So you could book everyone you loved, and I think I've booked pretty well all the writers here, which is tremendous fun. And then I had to write my own book. I felt that if I didn't do it then, I guess I was about 28, I wasn't going to do it, which of course is complete nonsense, and it would have been better if I'd waited. But Rob asked me to read this, and it starts in a hybrid form, and I think one of the very interesting and powerful aspects of form that we're getting to in a lot of the writing we've heard, actually, Helen Mort, certainly, Robert, is this very powerful thing that happens when you interleave fiction and non-fiction, and how you can borrow both those tools for your purposes, which may or may not be political. And when I teach it, I say, look, the deeper you bury the politics, the more effective the book. But that isn't necessarily so, as we heard yesterday, particularly with Underland. Occasionally, I think a writer gets bitten by a book and by a drive, which transcends that. And then you get Silent Spring, and then you get Power to Change. And I think what I've taken from this seminar so far, which has been extraordinary, is the idea, it was Sarah Hall's idea of the magpie. And some time ago, because I suffer from fits of depression every winter, which is sort of reassuring in a way, I decided that there was no such thing as one for sorrow, two for joy, because magpies are intensely sociable. So every time I see one, it's a half joy. And if you have to drive past, obviously it has to remain that way, but if you stay and watch, there's never just one. The other one is just in the bush, and they're very talkative, and they sort of clack to each other. So you get half a joy outside the bush, and the other half clacking from the middle of it, which I suppose is what I'm doing here. So the idea was, In the Eye of the Sun, I called it, terrible cliche first chapter title. And I used fiction to try and get my parents on stage, because one of the difficulties that we came across yesterday was where you classify nature writing and where you get put. And my stuff gets put everywhere in bookshops. I've been in gardening, I've been in biography, I've been in memoir, I've been in birds, nature writing. This is all for the same book sometimes. And my favourite, W.H. Smith's in Rochdale, which is a hellish place in many ways and wonderful in others, tragic life stories. So this is how I saw my parents meeting. They met at the House of Tongue at the tip of Scotland, near the furthest point north. As she walked into the room, he was the only man to stand up. They exchanged bright smiles, the kind that come from shyness. Neither was comfortable in the grand drawing room under the glassy stare of shot stags and the crossed swords of long-conquered Scots. And then you get my father, who's like a sort of spy in a boy's adventure story. His manners are too good. And then you get my mother, who wonderfully just couldn't deal with all the hunting, shooting, fishing, and stormed off in a huff. And he pursues her, and that's how it starts. And that's the reason for writing the book, was to find out what had gone wrong, because I think the children of divorced parents feel themselves guilty to be of some way, responsible for ending what was clearly a good thing before they came along. And so I thought, if I can write down everything I know about what happened to them, I will find out how much of my problems I'm responsible for, And of course, what happens when you write a thing is that narratives become inverted. And it turned out that it wasn't that my father was a cold rationalist who'd walked off and left us up a mountain, but rather he was intensely romantic, and my mum had fallen in love with a mountain, really, and out of love with a man. And not exactly kicked him off, but let him go. And so that was marvellous, and suddenly I got it. And one of the reviewers for the book, which seems kind of prescient now, was the great John Carey, said that if it shows us anything, it shows us that when nature does break down, it will be women who get us through. And in some ways, you find that everywhere. So what's happened to me as a writer is that I become a sort of investigative writer, a celebrant, yes. But the thing, when you say, what does nature writing mean to me? I understand nature as the safe place, as the thing that I get, as the place where I can be, where, a mountain makes sense to me, a meadow makes sense to me, a cardinal beetle makes sense. It's the other things, from men onwards, which I find mysterious. And so that's partly what I have been writing about for most of my career. And so I was going to bother you a bit more with like Men at Sea, if that would be interesting. Go on, Rob.
It would be very interesting. I only want to pause you to celebrate that first paragraph a little bit more, because it is an audacious way to begin a book, to begin a writing life. We'll set aside the chapter title, In the Eye of the Sun, as you have.
That's what the auctioneer called it when he was flogging them the farm. Yeah.
I was thinking about rhythm as I read this and heard this again. They met at the House of Tongue at the tip of Scotland, near the furthest point north. And there's a lovely way that tongue taps on that tip in that second phrase. As she walked into the room, he was the only man to stand up. There's balance there, but there's also a little bit of imbalance. They exchanged bright smiles, the kind that come from shyness. And then this extraordinary set of sight lines that get set up. Neither was comfortable in the grand drawing room, under the glassy stare of shot stags and the crossed swords of long-conquered Scots. And there is so much going on there. These shot stags gazing out across the room with their fixed eyes, these crossed swords, so much is set in motion. That was 3 sentences, and the whole book unfolds from that moment. And this is setting aside the audacity of writing in a semi-fictional, imaginative way about the meeting of your parents. And it seems to me that there is a technical brilliance at work combined with a huge readiness of risk-taking there that is very, very exciting to me to meet. And I was thinking about Nabokov's phrase. He says, the true reader reads not with his or her brain, but with his or her spine. They wait for the telltale tingle. And that gives me the telltale tingle. And it tells me a great deal about the writer that has followed that paragraph. So I just wanted to ask you about rhythm and about listening.
Yes, it's fascinating, especially as a parent, because you're very aware of the soundscape that your son is listening to. And one of the reasons why I left the BBC and left London was I couldn't take the soundscape anymore, ironically. It was fine at work. But outside, that grating roar of a city, there was something about it that it was too much. And wonderful listening to the soundscape of Munich. I noticed that lots of people sleep in the middle of town in their hotels with their windows open, because there's a quietness. And the same thing in San Francisco. Cities that work are very quiet, beautiful places sonically. And my stepson, who's a mischievous little fellow and very adept at a screen, and now bigger than me, so you can't take him off him anymore, he said, what is writing anyway? You know, what's the point? And what is it? And I thought, oh, God, I better get this right. So I said, Robbie, I think it's reading, rhythm, and something to say. And in the terrible troughs, between books when you don't quite know what you're doing, those are the sort of the truths I held self-evident. But a lot of it was the rhythm of speech of Radio 4 and listening to my mother constantly talking, I think, and then the sounds of the natural world. And what's wonderful, we were talking earlier about great radio producers we know. When you work with a really good one, if you're in the outdoors, they say, okay, wait. And you're listening to the soundscape, and so we're on a lake and we're recording a Welsh myth, a thing about herons and things, and he waits, and you listen to the water, you listen to the birds, and they're listening for a rhythm in nature itself, which is the right moment for you to start talking. And that strikes me as this wonderful crossover between science and mysticism. And as a travel writer, I still find things that science can't explain. I believe absolutely in wonder and the unexplained. And the time, the moment at which we understand it all is the moment which it ends. And so which is in some ways my grounds for hope, because, of course, so much of what the facts tell us is terrible. But little ventures and bigger ventures out into the world tell us that the regions as yet uncounted and beyond fact. And scale is one of them, which I'll come to, which you get in the oceans and the sea.
We should probably just give a name to one of those miraculous radio producers and listeners in the form of Tim D, who is also a writer of extraordinary rhythms and strangeness. Four Fields, The Running Sky. So
talks about birds being born with star maps imprinted in their skulls.
Read to us about men.
Okay, so men, fascinating topic. I never really know what one is. What do they do? How do you become one? What happens? And I think about the kind of top predators and why we love them so much. And clearly, once upon a time, man, the human male, was the top predator, and they've shaped the world into the state it is now, more or less, and are in many ways in full, wonderful, and kind of shaken, contested zone at the moment as a result, which is thrilling to see. And it's marvellous to be referred to as cisgender male. My students do it, and it really upsets university authorities because, if you're not ticking male or female on the first box, the whole world is suddenly kind of contested. So it's a marvellous revolutionary moment for that. But I found myself looking at men in quite traditional environments, and you get no more traditional than ship. And so I set off thinking ships was a brilliant idea because, and so often my ideas are best in the books, because here's this unwritten world in which everything depends, and for all our eco-credentials and aspirations, if you took away everything that was brought to you on a ship, we'd all be sitting here naked and on the floor, which probably wouldn't be here either, or there may be. Although it is interesting that world trade imports wood to Canada in the middle of winter at tremendous environmental cost and risk. There is no controlling mind of the market, which is what the sea teaches you. So anyway, I emailed a gigantic Danish container corporation called Maersk, and they said, you can go where you want and write what you want. We won't even lawyer you. And the reason, obviously, is that they're a $24 billion company, and if they stop their engines in 3 days' time, it's anarchy. So they're basically PR-proof. At the same time, they were kind of industry leaders, so they didn't think they had that much to hide. And I like to think I found some of what they did. But they were good as their word, and they didn't they didn't lawyer me much. No, they didn't lawyer me at all, actually. It was my publishers who did. And you see seafarers and the secret side of the world. And to their credit, at exactly the same time, they'd said yes to another writer called Rose George, whose book is in many ways much better and slightly different, called 90% of Everything. And so we were both going around the world at the same time thinking we were the first people to do it since Conrad, with a pen. So that was good corporate sort of spin docked, right? And the relationship between men and machines is interesting, and men in the absence of women, because it's still overwhelmingly a male place, the sea, containerized, the industrialized sea. And of course, the ship is an archetype of all feminine traits. She's wife, mistress, lover. She's a puzzle that's never finished. And I did find very good men out there, and something about the sea sorts them out. You can't really be a good sailor and a weak, self-indulgent and craven person because you wouldn't be able to do your job. So even if you are all those things, I certainly am. You have to kind of impersonate somebody else when you go out on deck. And I believe my captain had never really sailed with a bad sailor because he'd see straight through him and just throw him off. So anyway, this is far out on the other side of the world. And the engine is another thing, it's like they say, I asked one of them, the new ships have got 2 engines. What would you think of that? And he looked shocked. He said, it would be like having 2 wives. We're all very excited. We're in the Pacific. And the Pacific is just, it took us 10 days to go across. And you have to time jump. And so every second day, 10 o'clock in the morning becomes 1 o'clock lunchtime. And then one day you get 2 Tuesday the 26th back to back as you cross the date line. And by the end of it, nobody can really sleep or wake, and yet they've got to go round the clock. So early bed under glittering stars, then woke at 4:45 and got up. Others were up too. Joel said, thank God for the stabilizers. If they weren't out in this weather, no sleep. Another dawn, another breakfast. Conversation is fitful these days. The sea is growing off the port bow where it's been all this time. Bands of clear follow bands of mist over water an astonishing colour. Blue and purple black and bustling with waves. It is strange and exciting to look out from the deck all the way to the horizon and see nothing still anywhere. Chris is in an excellent mood. Everyone is excited about LA. You should see the atmosphere on a ship after 3 days of storms and no sleep, Chris says with grim relish. Pretty bad. Poison. The forces are spectacular and intermittent, like hands pressing down on your shoulders and your neck. Soren says you need to drink a lot of water in storms because all the guys are sick. He is in a meditative mood during his watch. He's also flying home from LA. What does it take to be a good officer, Soren? He thinks for a moment. You need to be able to feel the ship, like a body, like a creature. Is this a good ship? He looks down her all the way to the foremast in the Pacific. Oh, yes, she is a good ship. What else? To be a good seafarer, I think you need to feel salt on your skin. Once a seaman, always a seaman. And suppose your son says he wants to go to sea, Soren. What will you say? I would respect him, but I would warn him about loneliness, isolation, about needing to be strong with yourself. It is dark and rainy and very lively. Outside, the cargo sings and thumps in whines and bangs, loose things in the crates booming. We have been boarded by pirate poltergeists. Showers flood, wardrobe doors fling themselves open, batteries and lighters fly off desks. The bed refuses sleep. And then we head for America. So there's amazing daybreak. I'll just do it quickly. As I go to the forecastle at daybreak, it's still dark under the containers. The prow is silent and the ocean streams toward us. Weather here comes right down to the water as we drive into it and through it. We steam under low arches of cloud, through columns of vapor, the sea black beneath silver pillars. Now it is day, now it is night, the sea's surface unbroken and heaving like the flanks of a beast breathing. There are spirits of blue rain. How those old sailors needed their courage, even in morning warmth. The day then breaks into a vaulting blue with scars of white cloud in the highest, clearest air I've ever seen, and a patina of vapor like an eggshell glaze, translucent in one quadrant, and everywhere else, screaming clear, sun scintillant on the waters which are stilled. To take a vessel to the land of the free, you must clean the entire ship. You must search end to end for moths, particularly the Asian gypsy moth, and destroy them, plunging any colonies of eggs you find in boiling alcohol. You must switch from burning heavy fuel to low-sulfur diesel. You must submit crew details and an effects list to ensure no one tries to sell a load of Hong Kong iPads on the sly. You must destroy or remove any spills, garbage, or organic matter. You must lock all meat, fruit, and veg in stores and seal them. Not one apple core, says the captain. Not one piece of orange peel. We'll have all kinds of bullshit. We'll be fined. Someone always forgets this, Andreas confides. There is a lovely moment on the bridge towards sunset. The captain is in his chair, arms crossed, leaning back, relaxed. Chris is looking at something on the computer, and Andreas, the chief engineer, has joined us. The captain and the chief talk quietly in Danish, and then they fall silent. The sun makes bright bars as it sinks, and the sea is an endless dream, as though it has forgotten it can be anything but kind. I look at the faces of the men as they look at the sea, with equanimity, with satisfaction, and an unexpressed awareness of the temporary and the timeless, with acceptance and certainty that this was all and nothing at all, and that everything is always changeable, and that they are a crew whose completeness would only be proved tomorrow when it will be broken, and that they had brought their great ship to land again almost, and that foul weather and hardship lay in her futures and in all their separate courses, and that there would be ports, hopefully, at the end of them. And I thought for a moment I understood a little of seafaring men. You probably don't understand much of them because all you've got is a picture of them dreaming out the window, but it seemed important at the time.
How does a boy who grew up in a hill farm fall in love with the sea?
Oh, well, books, partly books, and Conrad and The Nigger and the Narcissus, some of the most amazing nature and descriptive writing ever. And I was very kind of patchily schooled and self-schooled, as a student. I was a terrible student. But the bits that I always reacted to in books, in works of fiction, were often the nature parts of it. And Swallows and Amazons, obviously. And I remember being absolutely terrified the first time I went on water, and then coming to love it. And, you at some point, some idiot, particularly masculine, but not exclusively part of you in youth, needs to test its boundaries and to find out, what fear is. And there's very interesting work being done by soldier writers now saying that, they went to shoot at people in Afghanistan because they wanted to know how they would be when they were shot at. And they talk about, I've interviewed soldiers who talk about young men in battle for the first time cheering and whooping, because they're there and it's happening and they can't believe it and they're scared, and that's how they're letting it out. But the best outlet I found when I'd sort of stopped stealing milk floats and grown up was on a lifeboat in the Bristol Channel, and that wonderful mixture of fear and exhilaration, and that idea that you're doing something useful, even if actually what you're doing is burning loads of fuel and jumping over waves. You're practicing to do something useful. And I think it's a very interesting generational difference. And it was fascinating at the end of the last session, that optimism and that anger in the younger generation, which is going to be absolutely key if we're going to turn all this around.
Just to clarify about the lifeboat, were you being rescued?
No, I was lifeboat Cox, Rob. Inshore lifeboat Cox, registered, yeah.
How long were you?
2 years, 1 year training and then 1 year on it. Yeah, Bristol Channel's amazing for that because it's the second highest rise and fall of tide in the world, so you get real waves.
You're a teacher, as well as the many other things you are. Tell me about some of your conversations with your students about some of the subjects we're talking about here. You teach this writing as well as writing this writing. Yes,
I see it partly as public service because there are times, obviously, in writing where it just feels like the worst kind of self-indulgence, and I do love to teach. And the other thing, I think it's about sowing hand grenades, isn't it? Because what you're trying to do is equip these young people with the tools to speak their stories, and the ambition and the confidence to seek them out, and the willingness to confront on paper, which is still, thanks to the internet, the most powerful place, the world that they find themselves in, that we've left for them. And I must say, I have massive hope for them. It's partly about that refusal to be boxed in to start with. But yeah, everything, even in my darkest depressions, the best moments, the moments where I'm not depressed at all, when I'm in front of a class, because then it's not about you anymore. You can forget it. It's about them. And it is a learning experience. It doesn't really help me write. It stops you writing, but it definitely helps you grow.
If you're happy to.
Well, one student in the room, nice.
Do you have conversations with them about I mean, clearly you do have conversations with them about gender, but this draw you feel towards and revulsion you feel towards a certain kind of masculinity that you've written 2 books about men in ships. It's something you're drawn back to.
I haven't really had those conversations. But the thing is, they see you as a teacher, and not really as a writer, and it's great. You're all in it together. You're kind of on equal footing. I admire men intensely. I think they are wonderful and astonishing, and especially seafarers, who in some ways are this kind of distilled version. And the loneliness and the stuff they grapple with, and of course, you mess it up. You mess it up really badly, and a frightened man is the most dangerous thing there is. But on the whole, I'm hugely admiring, and so it's definitely a work of celebration, of course. But the best places and the best times we often find kind of abroad and travel writing, where gender distinction goes. So I became a huge fan of Finland. Because I wrote this book about icebreaking, which is sitting on a Finnish icebreaker, a particularly odd way to find out about a country, but actually quite telling. And you look at the history of Finland, and Finland has the best record on gender equality. Women were always, when wonderful Ethel Brilliana Tweedy loses her best friend, her father, her money, her husband, all in the space of a year. And what's her solution? She's a mother too. She determines to become a travel writer. So she sets off for Finland, and she writes through Finland in carts. And the first thing she sees when she gets to Helsinki is women working on building sites. And you think, aha. And it comes back to the same John Carey quote about my mum. It's that when nature is extreme, if you're out in the Finnish wilds, there can't be any gender nonsense. You can't really do patriarchy because it simply doesn't work. The homestead breaks down. The system breaks down. Actually, it's quite a good moment. I could read you about silence and men. Because I was fascinated by what Helen Mort was saying about silence and this important and beautiful thing, which doesn't really exist, of course, pure silence. So I'm on an icebreaker in the Bay of Bothnia, and the sea is frozen, reassuringly frozen. We were looking for ice to break, in a way, and I thought I would go and have a cigarette. After dinner, I joined Penty in the smoking room. The smoking room is a steel box accessed from the main deck, a stinking coffin decorated with Playboy calendars dating back to 2010, each displaying a winter month with all the days neatly crossed out. So this is the art gallery. Yes. Have you been a cook on ships for a long time? All my life. Would you ever cook on land? No. Why? Why not? What's it like cooking on a ship? It's okay. He's very shy, and it's not fair to interrogate him. Let him finish his cigar in peace. Let's try this guy instead. Hello, I'm Horatio. Hey. What's your name? Mumble. Sounds like uni. May I ask what you do? A. What do you do? Engineer. Ah, right. So what do you do today? Pained look. Pause. Some little bit. And what will you do tomorrow? Agonized look. Hand to head. I don't know. Right, I'd expected this. Sometimes I'll meet men who do not have much English, who are shy and who have a Finnish reserve, which is reputed to out-reserve even the British version. This is a Finnish silence. They are famous. They come in different grades. There are relaxed silences, companionable, puzzled, contented, unhappy, charged and thoughtful silences, even lyrical silence. I will join Uni in a thoughtful silence. He stares at the steel bulkhead, a good move given the alternatives are Heather's bum or Kyra's boobs. The bulkhead is pale yellow, painted like that or nicotined over. Practice. A Finnish silence is just a question of practice. I can do this. Uni is rubbing his jaw as if he has toothache. We can do this. We are in heavy ice now, the ship grating and vibrating. Uni has half of his cigarette left. He is greyed and lined by cigarettes as I will be if I do not quit. I am doing this wrong. I am eating his silence. We can both feel it. No, worse, I am listening to his silence. Of course. How can you hope to share a silence if one of you is eavesdropping on the other? Quickly, I must listen to my own silence. Crash, thump, scrape, gripe goes the ice against the hull. And then if I can hear mine and he his, might we have been to hear or to share? Clash, clash, great. Something? This is hopeless. Something just whimpered. Was it Uni? Was it me? The women on the wall are laughing.
Brilliant. Let's talk about comedy. Let's talk about humour. It's sometimes said, and I've observed it, that nature writing, quote unquote, could do with a lot more jokes. Do you agree?
I do absolutely agree, yeah. You're a great one for jokes. I like that demand for humour, because humour takes the seriousness and the hopelessness out of a situation, doesn't it? And gives you somewhere to go. I do tell, so depression, anxiety, tidal waves of it sweeping through university. You tell people to tell their stories, tell their truths. The only bit of really good writing advice that's ever given to me was a friend of mine. I was in the middle of running for the hills. I thought, I'm exposing my parents, I'm selling off the family silver, I'm doing it cheap, and it's not even a good book. And my friend, Rob Kettridge, looked at me and he said, all we're asking, H, is that you give a true account of yourself. So that lit up kind of something in me. I was like, okay, fair enough. You can stand or fall on that. So when I teach it, I say to these young people and to adults, give a true account of yourself. Now, supposing the true account of yourself is anxiety and depression, very difficult to entertain a reader with that material, however moving and wonderful. So then what you want is a very funny book about depression, in a way, isn't it? And lots of people have tried to do it, because it is a kind of comical occupation. You go to a shop to buy supper, you get hit by the indecisions, and you come out clutching a pair of socks and an onion, and you think, what am I going to do with that? So yeah, humour saves us, and it can save all kinds of writing. Disguise infelicity, probably.
Your writing exists at a confluence of many points, like everyone's writing, but I'm always interested in the way in what we in Britain have taken to call nature writing is actually a mingling of currents of travel writing, natural history, anthropology, ethnography, etc., etc. We'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but in terms of humour, who for you are the funny predecessors, the ones you read to make you laugh and remind you that you can laugh?
Kurt Vonnegut, wonderful, and another kind of radical prophet for our time. And whenever I got stuck, I always read his introduction to Slaughterhouse 5, where he goes to see his buddy O'Hare, and they're going to have a bottle of whiskey, and O'Hare's wife isn't talking to him, and she's absolutely furious. And he says, what's going on, O'Hare? And he says, and then she bursts in and speaks for herself, and she says, I know what you're going to do. You're going to sit there and drink the whiskey and talk about old times and make it all right and send more boys off to war, basically. And he says, I promise you, Mrs. O'Hare, that's the last thing I'm going to do. So I love Vonnegut's humour, which is also bound up with death and the face of death. And the other one, and another great nature writer, is P.G. Wodehouse. Wodehouse can do a summer day like nobody. He can do a wonderful kind of English bucolic scene and then undercut it all. So yeah, that tradition, definitely. And Jerome K. Jerome, another wonderful writer about nature. 3 Men in a Boat, the scene with the swans where they all come and attack Harris. And Harris sort of fights 2 of them off. And so they go off disgruntled and they come back with 50 more swans and take Harris out. And it's all kind of very unlikely. And there are really dark currents in that book about suicide and alcoholism. And it's all done so beautifully with kind of humour and beauty, but it's all there to be read. So those guys.
I remember once reading I was working on material histories and conflict, and some of you will know Tim O'Brien's work, The Things They Carried. And I became interested in books that soldiers had carried into war or read near or at the front line. Partly this emerged out of writing I was doing about W.H. Murray, the mountaineer who was taken prisoner at the Battle of Tobruk in the Second World War, and then spent the remainder of the Second World War in a series of European prisoner of war camps in Germany and then in Italy. And while in those camps, he wrote one of the, to me, great dream works of British mountaineering literature, which is very inauspiciously called Mountaineering in Scotland. And for that reason has not met the readership it should, though it's a cult book among many climbers, I think. And he wrote this book first on toilet paper that he bartered for pages from a complete works of Shakespeare that his mother sent him through the Prisoner of War Red Cross program. And he managed to do this bartering because it was better to wipe your bottom with the complete works of Shakespeare because it was firmer and your hands didn't go through it. And he wanted the toilet paper because it was blank. And he wrote most of this extraordinary book. And he then was moved from a German to an Italian prisoner of war camp. And at the point of moving, the document was discovered and he was interrogated. And he said, this is a book about the mountains I climbed before I came here, and And they said, no, it's a record of troop movements, and they destroyed it. And he then was relocated to an Italian prisoner of war camp in sight of high mountains. And there he then wrote a version of the book that became the book that was published after the war. And this was at a time when he thought he would probably never climb again. His body was suffering all the deficiencies and privations of occupation. I tell this because I was remembering when you were talking about Jerome K. Jerome that in the scorched rucksack of one of the British soldiers on Spion Kop in the Boer War, a copy of Jerome K. Jerome, burnt by shellfall, was found in the pack. And I've always thought about that. I mean, regardless of the context of the Boer War, which obviously is a grotesque episode in British history, but a sense of that river journey, that the darkness of that river journey, but also the beauty and the humor of that river journey as the book that was carried by that soldier to that place where he died. And I suppose I want to ask you about reading and displacement from that. When you're away, you travel a lot to write as a travel writer in shorter forms as well as in longer forms. Do you take books with you to read, to take you away from the place you are in, or do you need full focus on what is around you? I'm thinking of the details you transcribed from the Playboy calendars, which were so striking in their precision.
Mm. Yes, well, I mean, that's the sad thing about great ships is they all have wonderful libraries. Seafarers' organisations and the Mission to Seafarers, often Christian port organisations, will equip ships with wonderful libraries, and they're never used now. People go to their cabins and watch DVDs, and so it's become a very lonely thing in a way that it wasn't, which is, of course, is the whole symptom of our world, and clearly the reason for our anxiety is our telephones. You make decisions. So I travelled the length of Africa and Europe following migrating swallows, and I knew that a writer, who wants to be a writer has to take a book. And I had somebody gave me the Lonely Planet Guide to Africa, which is really quite a big piece of work, and obviously I'm going to carry it. So I took a bread knife to it, and I cut out all the countries I wasn't going to visit. And you can't do that to a Kindle, can you? But then, of course, you might not need to, but then, of course, Kindles need batteries, blah, blah. So I took Seamus Heaney's prose, his collected prose, which, when poets write prose, it's just devastating. So that was it. And then I ended up giving that away too. And in fact, what happened to me on that trip was I'd written, it's a warning to non-fiction writers. The proposal is easy. You can write a proposal in a weekend, really. And if the idea is good enough, you can sell it. And then you have to go and do it. But you have to be so careful about what you write. So I'd had this idea that I would cross Africa really because it wasn't about the migrating swallows. It was about the people I was going to meet en route. And I said, by the time I get to the Mediterranean, I will be like a migrant too, and I will cross with them. And obviously, it sounded great on paper. But the thing was, by the time I got to the Mediterranean, I was really skinny and really wired and kind of in bits. And I just gave everything away. And it gets to the point in Gibraltar. This is the one bit of my work that Ian Sinclair really admires, where I throw my rucksack off Europa Point into the sea at Gibraltar because it had a bull in it, you see, that I'd been given in Cameroon. And I realized my rucksack was absolutely stuffed with the treasures of Africa. And I had done what every other young, privileged white boy had ever done, was I'd gone to Africa and taken what I was going to get and gone home, and I was now going to kind of cash in. And so in a fit of madness, because it had my notebooks in it too, I threw them into the sea, which I regret. But not necessarily the gesture. It was a poorer book for it, probably, but it was a richer experience, because then you are down to a couple of euros and a phone number, which was all I had when I got to Spain. And that's pretty authentic. That's more or less the situation in which people arrive. And it's fascinating reading the reviews of that book sometimes, if one dares to, because it does divide people. You get accused of having this appalling kind of white guilt where everything white and European is bad and male is bad, and this guy's somehow gone native in this mad phrase. But I just don't feel that at all. And the tutorial of animals, of course, and the project of my life is to destroy the idea of national boundaries. It's going really well, thanks. They are nonsense. My idea for the swallow, the thing that worked with swallow, was that you could go from one country to another and ask people, what do you call these birds? And they will tell you, it's Inconjani, the lightning bird, the breaker of rocks, or in Zambalo, it's Tififillis, or it's Nyankalema, the bird that never sleeps. And of course, there is only one road, and it stretches from the Literature House all the way to Cape Town. Everybody along it is your friend and will look after you. Borders are completely meaningless and pointless and only serve ghastly corporations and corrupt governments. And the Swallow is a simple sort of teaching tool, MacGuffin. So I was pleased with it was more like a piece of performance art than a book in the end. But that's kind of what it's about for me. I simply don't believe in nationality beyond the level of the football pitch, rugby pitch, actually rugby pitch. There it's great, it makes a lot of sense, but after that it's poisonous and world-destroying nonsense. And the great Palestinian writer, Raja Shadada, Palestinian Walks, we had a conversation behind a curtain in Hay, and I said, how long do you think boundaries are going to last? He said, for some time longer, but not forever.
Thank you. I've walked with Raja Shahada in the occupied territories and in Cambridgeshire, and I remember walking with him in England, in southeast England, and we came to a farmer's field. So Raja lives in Ramallah part of the time, and so his ability to move beyond the immediate perimeter of the town, the wolf border, as the Finnish phrase has it, is highly governed, highly regulated, and dangerous. The zoning of the occupied territories is such that you can't really do it, but he still does it because it's a declaration of freedom and of possibility and of resistance. And we came to a farmer's field in England, and a big field, East Anglian big field farming, recently been ploughed, so it looked like a Red Sea. It would have been very difficult to walk across it, thick, wet. And right through the middle, where the line of the footpath on the map met the field, there had been left by this farmer a strip of turf. So he had ploughed up to that point, and then he had left a strip of turf 3 feet wide, taken his tractor out, and then ploughed the rest of this vast field. And that was a respect for the existence of the footpath. And it was a declaration of thoughtfulness for the need of the pedestrian and the right of way of the footwalker not to have to slog across a wet red ocean. And Raja stood at this Red Sea and looked at this bridge that had been left by a landowner, and he was astonishingly moved by it. And I only understood why he was so moved by it when we walked together subsequently in Ramallah. One of the many things that Horatio does is write for children, and he writes prize-winningly, astonishingly, for children. And I've read his books to my children and watched what happens to them. And it's something very special, and it doesn't happen with every book. And even in those books, well, depression and sadness finds its way, and in a way is the enemy that must be befriended, perhaps, might be a way of putting it. But I wondered if you're able to talk about what it means to write for children for you, and perhaps, can you read us any, or did you not bring
I've got a little bit. You made me think about it in the last session when you were talking about anthropomorphism. And anthropomorphism is something I've never really had a problem with because of growing up with so many animals, which had so many, a flock of sheep is a flock of personalities, and it really is the case. And of course, personality, as well as other genetic things, can descend in some ways through genetic lines. So you'll get a lamb, and its great-grandmother jumped over fences, and sure enough, it's a jumper. And the other thing is they can learn it. So if a sheep once jumps over a fence, that's it, you'll never hold it in. And anthropomorphism, when Sarah Hall said, that a wolf experiences glee, I was like, finally. So what it is actually is that glee is a wolf emotion that humans are able to access. I see the emotions themselves as central, and us, living in kind of overlapping, because we are, after all, animals. And the reason we've let the planet go into such a wonderful, terrible state is because we've been able to deny our animalness. And there is interesting work being done on this, like Charles Foster being a beast. And the writers I loved most when I was growing up, like B.B., who could write about being a fox from a fox's point of view. And apart from calling him Rufus, and I think he was, now looking back, he was probably a bit of a white middle-class fox, but, he was in Northamptonshire, so fair enough. It was absolutely otherwise entirely it appeared to me to be what a fox is and was. So writing for children is just a joyful, playful place for me because you're aware your audience really aren't neurotic. They're neurotic for 10 minutes before bed or whatever. So it's a release, and I love it. And still learning to do it really. But the first one, it was a book partly to explain depression to a child in a way that might be fun. It's called OBrien the Terrible Ute. So you've got a little boy. When my son was born, he has his mother's iron kind of gun barrel blue eyes. I thought this kid is never going to take no for an answer, and sure enough, he doesn't. So there's your kind of characteristics of a hero, so I nicked those. And then depression, this monster that can't be killed. So you've got a boy that can't be beaten and a monster that can't be killed, and a father who is the victim of it all. It's fun. And so I'm going to read you a bit of really kind of non-PC nature writing. And herons came up before, and my friend Julian, we were making this documentary on Llangorse Lake, one of the bottomless lakes of Wales. And he said, we looked at heron, he said, Dylan Thomas said, they were priests. I don't think they're priests, I think they're judges, a bit creaky and out of touch. If that isn't the perfect. So anyway, here's one. If you have had the luck to become acquainted with a grey heron, you will know what wry, dry birds they are, for all they spend so much of their time in water. And of course they are very big and angular, and their beaks are as sharp as Romans' short swords. The herons landing in the garden, the swoop and swish of it, the bounce, break, flap, and the great bird suddenly towering over him would have made Aubrey jump a few days ago, but what a few days they'd been. Hello, Aubrey cried, grinning at the heron's ring-gold eye. Welcome to Woodside Terrace. Call me Ardea, said the heron in a rather laconic way. Good of you to invite me. Oh, I didn't. It's all Athene Noctua. I know, said the heron. You could see he was amused. Why would anyone invite a lanky, shanky big nose into their garden on their own initiative? But I didn't mean that at all, Aubrey cried. I know, said the heron, trying hard not to show his enjoyment. Sarcasm, lowest form of wit before you come to slapstick, which I happen to rather like. Do you know the difference between a banana and a missing manhole cover? I'm not coming to yours for pudding. I hear you are in want of a fish. It was Aubrey's turn to stop himself laughing. Yes, he said seriously. Dad needs to eat fresh fish. They don't sell any in town. It's all frozen. Type of fish, said the heron. Species of fish, size of fish, gender of fish. You do know there is more to fish than fresh, frozen, and shell, right? Sarcasm, Aubrey retorted, highest form of humour for low-witted wading birds. Hey, I like that, the heron said, sounding impressed. You wouldn't write that down for me and sign it. Aubrey ignored this. We need oily fish. Oily it will be, said the heron. Try not to get too bored without me. I will be 26 minutes precisely. Clear the runway. Clear. Off he goes. 26 minutes later, to Ferriby's astonishment and Aubrey's admiration, Ardea the heron landed in the garden again. How could you be so precise? Aubrey wanted to know. The heron had his head tipped back. He said, Gawk! Gawk, Aubrey repeated. Have you run out of words? Gank, coughed the heron, and its eye flamed a ferocious gold. I don't think I've ever come across that one. Could you write it down for me and sign it? The heron narrowed its eye, took 4 quick steps, threw its long neck out over the pond, opened its beak, and heaved up a stunning silver-green fish, over a foot long and vigorously alive. This fish fell into the pond with a splosh and immediately began swimming around in fast circles. The pond was barely bigger than a bird bath. The fish looked like a whale shark in there. Fish times 1, said the heron with dignity. Trout, rainbow, male, oily. Delicious however you cook it, even better raw. Liberated from Beck Fish Farm, 12 minutes flying time. Does that conclude our business? Sorry, Ardea. Ha, gank. You got to admit it was quite funny. Fair point, said the heron. It was. So are you going to be okay with killing this fish, or would you prefer to look away while I do it? Oh, I don't know. You just whack it on the head, do you? That works, the heron agreed. Get a good grip, which is as hard as it looks, and bash it on a rock. And don't let it talk you out of eating it. We all have to live. Stuff, eat stuff. Way of the world. Don't let any fish whaling soften your heart. Fish whaling? Yeah, the usual. My poor fish kids, they need me, have mercy. My fish wife, how will she survive? Oh, to think I'll never see her again. Please don't kill me, I beg you. That kind of thing, on and on. Don't listen. Take him by the tail and whack. I don't know if I can do it now. Poor fish. Well, don't blame you. Can't stand it myself. It's one of the reasons we like to swallow them as quickly as possible. Spear, swallow. That's it for me and for them. Why don't you let your father do it? He won't hear a thing. I suppose he might do it. My mother's a straight shooting sort of bird, isn't she? She'd do it, wouldn't she? Right, said OBrien, making a sudden decision. I'll do it. It's okay to kill things if you're going to eat them, isn't it? I don't know about okay, said the heron. Vegetarians would disagree, but a top predator like me doesn't get that menu. I find killing fish rather beats starving to death. Different for you, of course. You have to make a moral choice.
There's a line I wrote down from Icebreaker, where you say, now I think of ice as a being. We've heard you on herons as beings, but I wonder, picking up a little bit on what we were talking about in the previous session, about what it means to think of ice as a being.
Well, I grew up frightened or hateful, really, hating the Tory party, maggots, crows, the east wind, and ice. It was my mother, black ice particularly, because we lived in a very steep track, and so we were always taught that it could kill us. So we always looked out for black ice. And one of the miracles of my childhood was the day the spinney froze to a depth of about 3 feet. And there was an entire wood in ice. And we just sort of went round it on our backs all day, and it was a miracle. The dogs and us in exactly the same place. There were dogs playing on ice. And then so this ice-breaking thing comes along, and I went. And it's a deeply paradoxical relationship we have with it, clearly. I mean, so to be an icebreaker, as a seaman, you need ice. And yet you're escorting ships full of coal to Finland to get rid of ice, or rather away from Finland, Russian coal going down to Germany and other places. And ice, there's a book called A Farewell to Ice by Peter Wadhams, which is the most frightening book I've ever read, bar none. And he says, he explains the miracle of ice and how there will be physicists among you, certainly, who will know this better than I do, but ice is miraculous because water is miraculous, and it can bond with anything because the length in the hydrogen bonds varies, so it's highly mutable in different states. And it may have covered the planet, we think, possibly 3 times, creating snowball Earths, which is a way to think about what's going to happen with climate change. I mean, the planet is going to go on, whatever. It just may not be to any of our descendants' liking. And that was one of the things that came up as a parent and also as somebody looking at ice, is that we've made the contract, and you never hear it said, but we're pretty deeply not content, but resolved that our great-grandchildren should run out of planet before our children should want for anything. And if there was one campaign I was going to do, it would be to take the plastic toys off the front of magazines, because children love magazines. But how difficult it is to buy a magazine without a bloody plastic toy on the front. And so going out to meet ice was wonderful and terrifying. And the reason Wadham's book is so frightening is because the ice he's worried about is the ice on seabeds. And he says if we lose that, which was laid down, it's permafrost, it's been there for a long time, it's been there since the last ice age, then you get massive methane release. And of course, as you know, 23 times more effective than CO2 in raising global temperature. And then you get a point where we, fast feedback, where through radiation forcing, in other words, loss of albedo, it goes beyond the point where we can do anything about it. And humanity's adjustments will make no difference. And then it comes very, very quick. And at this point, you talk about mass devastation, floods, fires, and famine, the apocalypse, basically. But what's so scary about it is the dates. He talks about 2035, the Met Office talks about 2040, and that's a business-as-usual scenario, which, of course, thanks to the young and thanks to seminars like this and thanks to all of us, is not going to happen. We're not doing a business-as-usual scenario anymore. But in the event that we did, then this book becomes in some way, which is awful, really, and what keeps happening with travel writing, but then I guess it's always happened, is it becomes a record of a vanished world. And we talked, didn't we, this morning about loss and archiving and the memory. So there are bits of ice, there's quite a lot of ice here. But what it is, well, I'll just read you the bit where I kind of walk on it. So you get off and you walk around on it, which is wonderful. and it returns you to childhood straight away. And it was noticeable that my shipmates needed to have a job. You know, we couldn't just be out on the ice mucking around or in wonder. So they took a drone, and they flew a drone round and round the ship. And if there's one thing that, doesn't change very much from one second to another, it's a ship stuck in ice. But it was important for our masculinity and for, our employment that we were doing something. And so there was heaven and hell there. I mean, in the Pleistocene era, as I was reading, you asked me what you read. So on an icebreaker, you go through the drawers of the cabin because they're changeover. So you're going through other people's old lives, and it's legit because it's now your cabin. And there are magazines from the 1980s, and there's one about Mary Leakey, and she's just discovered the Laetoli footprints. And there are these first hominids, and they're walking possibly in a family group, possibly at evening down to a waterhole. And you think, crumbs, that was us, what a long way we'd come. But at that time, the climate was completely unstable, and it was very hot and very wet. So even if we'd had settled agriculture, it wouldn't have worked. And of course, in a way, we find ourselves approaching the same junction. So I'm there in an icebreaker, there to kind of smash ice and keep world trade going. And at the same time, the height of the sea then, when these footprints in the magazine were discovered, would have been about our mast height, which is probably where it's going back to. So you sit there thinking, my goodness, the ghosts of ancient climates are going to be raised again, which is no doubt part of your project, Rob. So that was the sort of hell of it. And it was something about the way we regard it. So I'll just read you this. Our purpose was destruction, but there was no benefit to us in final victory. All the while, we wished the weather colder. We wished that more ice would form. Though the crew relished rest and the abeyance of that juddering contact, something in us, which was explicit in Sampo and Ville, also longed for our opponent to offer more defiance. This double impulse seemed a portrait in miniature of a particular relationship with nature and the earth. The more deeply buried its treasures, the vaster its oceans, and the more mighty its resistance, the greater the invention and the resolution Earth has drawn from us. From the Pliocene until now, until this fractional instant of geological time, Earth has been matchless. But now, suddenly, its opposition is wilting. The planet threatens to become soggy, tempestuous, and backward as ghost climates of older worlds are disinterred and loosed again. Perhaps this partly explains our ongoing rapacity, our ever more frenzied extraction, and the feebleness of our plans for change. It is as if we are disappointed in the Earth, like adolescents struggling to accept a parent's vulnerability. Can it really be so sensitive? Is the ice so thin? It seems to be harder for humankind to nurse a wounded opponent than to battle one still vigorous. But it is touching and revealing that even icebreakers practice conservation. According to Thames' report on Chemi Tornio, pristine ice is husbanded there, an unbroken lane which can be used at the season's end, so the chips are not trapped in sugar, which is sticky ice balls of their own making. And then there was the heaven, the brightest spell I remember from the Bay of Bothnia, the privilege and amazement of standing on the sea. A spiral of scribbles on the page of the bay, the plot of Otso's voyage could have belonged to salvagers or treasure hunters searching for the Sampo of the Kalevala, that miraculous world-making mill. We seemed to find it that sparkling day when we stepped from the ship onto the ice in a storm of light. The discovery that the sea really was made solid gave me a fizzing exhilaration. I jumped on the ice as if to test it, trying to land lightly, laughing with delight. If it was familiar to the crew, it was a miracle to me that the air was all scintillant, that the horizon was a weld flash of ice and sky, that distance could only be measured in colour until colour dissolved into glare. Our bright-suited figures were slow blobs, laughable and laughing. Light poured down and up at once. In the silent vortex of the albedo, I felt a mingling of calm and wonder, as if all superfluity had been whipped away. While standing on a mountaintop grants you the vista of a scoop of space, from valley bottom to cloud level and beyond, standing on the sea under clear air erases depth and height. The sky begins in the snow under your boots. You are simultaneously huge and as tiny as a fleck. The stillness of the air held a charge in it, for nothing around us was stable. Between the sun and the frigid air, creation and destruction were in whirling play. On the underside of the ice below us, congelation growth thickened the crystal layers, while in the ridges of our footprints, radiation tickled them minutely away. Although you could not hear it or see it, you could not help but sense it, a molecular dance, a duel, and effervescence at the edge of perception, the making and melting of ice. There you go.
That is a brilliant passage, I think, and it seems to me that it's an example of the first person doing something interesting here, that it's being extended and challenged and deleted, certainly depleted, by what is going on around it, but is still a sensing technology that is very important. Meanwhile, the view moves impossibly under the ice to what is happening, to what is building down there below, where the eye can't see, the optical eye. And it seems that mobile, technologized, scientific, unsettled first person is possibly quite characteristic of what we're talking about. The Finnish folk epic that Horatio mentioned there, the Kalevala, is, to me, an utterly extraordinary text, not least because of its premonitory aspects. And I've written twice about the Kalevala now, once in a book called Landmarks and once in the final chapter of Underland, which goes into the deep nuclear waste storage facility that the Finns have very successfully and cleanly constructed at Olkiluoto, which is called Onkalo, which means the hiding place. But the Kalevala, we've been talking a lot about how indigenous knowledge and folklore takes on in the Anthropocene, if we want to call it this uncanny quality of foresight. Oh, this was already known. This was already seen. We need to go back to these older storage sites of knowledge and vision and read them for what they are telling us now. And the Kalevala is about this substance, device, machine called
Sampo.
The Sampo, which is nuclear power. It is so many things. It is this mobile signifier at the heart. But it was fascinating to read you finding the Kalevala as uncannily present and prescient as I have.
Astonishing thing. So the Sampo is basically it's a mill or it's an astrolabe, depending on who you listen to. It's this bewitched, enchanting object which can grind out salt and gold and different things depending, but which causes insanity in those that don't have it and ultimate power and riches in those that do. And a lot of the Kalevala dramatizes this kind of confrontation between the almost enlightened males of the south and the dark witches of the north. And wonderfully, depending on which version you read, the Kalevala gets damaged in the fight for it and is smashed and ends up in the sea, where it goes away, grinding out salt and making the oceans saline. So it's rather marvelous, something about ancient Finnish sensibility, that we reduce it to call it a salt cellar, call it what you want, but it's the thing that makes men and women mad and keeps it all going. So yes, nuclear power is absolutely...
is one of the many things it is.
Yeah.
I thought, we've got about 25 minutes left. I thought what we might do is end with another reading from Horatio, perhaps picking up on the idea of radical optimism, perhaps from Curlew. But before then, open to you, so that there's a chance for you to ask and talk, and then end with a reading. So I don't know if the microphones are both working and ready. Start with Julien.
We could also come out a bit early. You don't have to sit through another 25 minutes. You've been incredibly patient.
Well, hello. Yep. Thank you for that. That was very engaging and humorful. I was wondering, going back to nature writing, about the idea of walking into nature to discover ourselves that we've been talking about, and how terror and fear plays into that. Because there's one passage that really marked me from Down to the Sea in Ships, which is where you cross the Pacific, and it's about your experience. So not the other men on the boat, but your experience. And it struck me as quite terrifying, just being there in that absolute desert for 12 days or however many it was. And then Rob writes about the sublime, and Helen Moore talked about wild swimming in the ocean and being at the mercy of the elements without any form of control. And I was wondering, how important is it to feel that in nature, to feel that nature can also be so much stronger than we are, without any form of control, when you think about the necessity for wonder, for beauty, when we want to save it. And also, doesn't that make all of our climate change debate about us? Because as you said, the planet will go on just without us if we don't fix it.
Yes, I think it's about terror, or at least fear, being a necessary part of proportion. And of course, human beings hate it, and so we've done so much to eradicate it, and haven't we done brilliantly? It isn't the safest place in the world, you know, your bed with a phone. You can't really go wrong. And yet, that's where, you know, the anxiety and the impotence, I think, stems from, and the introvertedness and the sort of ways of depression. And the thing I found about nature is that, of course, it's a sense of proportion. I mean, the wonderful thing about a buzzard is that to a buzzard, we're just crap buzzards, you know, which I find consoling and reassuring. And the thing about fear, well, I'm a terrible coward. You know, ideally, I've kind of put myself in the way of life. That's sort of your only qualification as a travel writer is kind of get out there and see what happens. And I remember being very frightened before I crossed Africa because I didn't know anything, you know, anything. And I asked a man who did, and he said, a level head and a humble heart get you out of anything. And so that's kind of my tenet for it. The seafarers didn't talk about it because to talk about it was to summon it again. So when they did talk about it, they used shorthand and evasion, and it was very uncharacteristic because they talk about anything once they get to know you, and they kind of slightly trust you. But fear, no, not really. And there were amazing writing about, particularly in places like the North Atlantic during wars. Submarine commanders would grow ridges, and you could see it in their fingernails. There would be a ridge of calcium for each trip. What was interesting for the doctor who identified this was it happened very much to the senior rates, to the commanders, to the officers, but not to the men lower down. Because at some point, it's fear for others. And this is another thing which I find very touching about masculinity, is that when you talk to soldiers, what haunts them when they come back from battle, and I've met 1% who aren't really haunted, but 99 absolutely haunted, and it's the loss of others. And of course, this is what's twisted and tortured to make them go into it in the first place, is the risk of others. But the most jumpy commanders are those who felt that they didn't fight hard enough to get the resources they needed to save more of their boys' lives. And it wasn't, in the end, about killing other people. It was about trying to prevent the death of your own, having put them into this position. So, yeah, fear is a big one. And, of course, we're so good at reassurance and safeguarding now that we've taken a lot of fear out of life. And so our fears seem to us to be abstract and deferred to the future, which, of course, has probably never been the case with humanity before. You know, even with disease. You know, you look at Ebola. I travelled through the Congo forest and had my own encounter with a kind of ghost of Ebola. But, you know, I remember my stepson saying, you know, is it going to come here? And I thought, you know, we grew up with the shadow of the bomb. The shadow of Ebola is probably as close as you get. And there's something kind of refreshing about physical, tangible fear, because you can deal with it. It's as we were saying in the session earlier on, it's the enormity of almost abstract fear, which, of course, isn't abstract at all, that really messes with us.
Hannah.
Hi, Horatio.
Hello.
I'm Hannah. I liked what you just said about the buzzard, observing us and considering us just rubbish buzzards, non-buzzards. Just highlights again to me the comic absurdity, the idea of nature observing us and our binary oppositional dualisms. I just wanted to say thanks for being here, and it's been a real pleasure to hear you speak, and wish you all the best.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much indeed for having me.
Thank you for that. Yes, Fred.
I think if I followed you, use the metaphor of selling the family silver for some of your anecdotal prose. And so I guess off the back of that, I'm wondering, is anything too personal? And if the answer is no, is anything too narcissistic?
Narcissism is a fascinating one because it's exactly what you deal with. And I had the experience of the eye running out on my keyboard. When I finished running for the hills, it wouldn't work anymore. I thought there's a message here somewhere. And then I wrote a book called Truant, which was about kind of youthful narcissism and the way that was fed in the 90s by the feeling that the end of history was here and that you could just take drugs and lie back and wait for narcissism to strangle you in your bed, which kind of happened to me and quite a lot of my friends briefly. The good thing about that generation, and I don't think you've seen the best of us yet, is that you do get a lot of self-knowledge that way. And so, you know, Lifeboats was all fun and games at the time, but now a friend of mine who appeared to be doing lifeboats just because he wanted to drive fast has invented a lifeboat in a box. The charity is called Atlantic Pacific, and it's a 40-foot shipping container with a lifeboat in it, and in the end of it, the lifeboat's 21 feet or whatever, is a lifeboat station, including bunks and a radio station. So you can pick up a 40-foot shipping container and take it anywhere in the world, and suddenly, the tagline of Atlantic Pacific, and please donate if you think it sounds good, is lifeboats where they had none. And he sent one to Somalia. I said, Rob, this is a really tough, really fast boat. What do you think they're going to do with it in Somalia? And he said, well, it doesn't matter, does it? They can never say that they don't have lifeboats. So that kind of youthful narcissism and those hopefully turn into good things. But yeah, I'm aware of it as a writer. And if I've got better, it's because I've taken myself out of the books more and more. And you can tell I'm floundering when it starts being about me. I mean, that's the last thing I want it to be about.
At the back, and then we'll come there.
Hi, I'm currently undertaking a Carnegie Research Scholarship with a focus on mental health in literature, particularly poetry. I'm just fascinated by what you said about seasonal affective disorder and the way that our own mental health can be so affected by the whims of nature. I'd be interested to know if you believe that the sort of intrinsic and physical and mental connection to nature impedes your work in a way that it stops you from writing about what you want to write about. The idea of depression, that's often the thing that most people will comment upon. They can't do what they want to do. It affects them in that way. Or if you feel that more so, it actually, informs your work.
Thank you. Well, a lot of my depression is self-inflicted. I know I'm no good in the winter. I ought to be able to deal with that. It's about getting out, really. It's very simple stuff for me. It turns out, fish oil, vitamin D, St. John's wort, even if they're placebos, they really work on me, and I don't think they are. And vitamin D certainly isn't. And it's about introversion and laziness. So the way I combated it last winter was to write a winter journal about it. And again, I kept myself out of it. And what happens is editors will come back to you and say, can you put yourself in? So we've got someone to follow through this stuff. And I thought it was very interesting, that idea we had in the last discussion about, the danger of using nature as a consoling and kind of keeping it natural capital because in some way it's good for our mental health. But without it, we're lost. That idea of a bare planet, of fields that you can walk across and see nothing, this gives nothing back that you can't get on a running machine in a gym. So unless we are going to just jump into space stations with gyms on board, we have no choice but to maintain, or at least in some way protect and preserve. Otherwise, I think we do go gently loopy, and we end up living, I don't really know what our purpose would be then, apart from kind of adjusting serotonin levels through various kind of intakes. And then it all becomes very Kurt Vonnegut, stuff that. It's like Galapagos, when isn't it his ultimate thing, a kind of cross between a Toshiba computer and a fur seal? That's what survives.
I'm grateful that you read from one of your children's books as well. And you said that you were just beginning to learn to produce that kind of writing. And I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about what you are learning and how what you are learning relates to the other types of writing that you do.
Well, it has a bearing on nature writing. Thank you for the question, because, of course, after the last rhino horn has been ground down into the last kind of placebo Viagra, these children's bookshops will still be full of stories about rhinos, and you'll be able to buy toy rhinos. And when nature writing in Britain has been going through this wonderful kind of golden age, and, of course, it's stuffed with animals. And we find it quite difficult to relate to children without animals. If you take animals out of parent-child interaction, it's a whole, isn't it? Because how do we understand who we are in relation to anything? We instinctively know that, the child identifies with the wolf pup. And at some level, we are intimately, entirely connected and similar species on a similar planet. So that side of it I find fascinating. And also how good it is. So Catherine Rundell, for example, some of the most fantastic nature writing is going on inside children's books, like The Wolf Wilder and her recent one, The Explorer. So tremendous bits of nature writing, and it's about fear, to return to Julian's question, and telling children that life is a fearful place. And don't arrange your fears, she says, in the best light, which I think is just such a wonderful thing, and kind of feel the fear and run towards it anyway, which, of course, children will get. So yes, it's a very interesting time, but I did have an interesting moment with my son. I was trying to get him to go to sleep, and I was reading The Wolf Wilder by Catherine Rundell in my most boring voice. And they're out in the, it's 1917, and they're in the Russian forest, and it's all snowy, and the wonderful Wolf Wilder produces a knife, Theo. And Aubrey, why do they have knives, Daddy? Because they live in the middle of nowhere, Bug, and they need knives so they can survive. They can have food. Why don't they go to the shops? Because there aren't any shops out there, Aubrey. Why don't they take the knives, cut down the trees, and build a shop? I thought that's what we did.
Any more questions? I think one more, and then I might ask Horatio to read it. No? Okay. Yes, one at the back.
Hi, Horatio. Thank you for your reading. I would like to ask you a little bit more about the seamen that you mentioned, in particular whether they had any type of language or way of interacting with their environment while they were at sea. I ask because I come from Shetland, and up until the industrialised fishing came into being, there was this kind of superstitious language held between Shetland fishermen where you couldn't name certain things at sea with their common name, particularly animals. And they also developed their own language just for interacting with each other. And I'm just wondering if that extends further nowadays and still exists.
Yeah. I mean, my sense is that the Scottish and the Shetlanders have this wonderful kind of almost the most powerful connection with superstition and the sea, and with good reason, because of course it's the most terrifying sea there is out there. But yes, so the language of the sea is English, but not kind of my RP English. They found that quite hard to disentangle. It's this mixture of Filipinos speaking English and Danes speaking English and Romanians and Indians, and they would all meet in a very shorthanded, excellent English, which is the sort of language of the sea. But yeah, the way that their own personal language goes with what they do is that they're really quite romantic, particularly the very good ones who've chosen it and didn't just fall into it, but not at all sentimental. And so this manifests itself in wonderful superstitions, like you can't turn your back on the sea, and bare feet on steel, I got told off for that. And whistling obviously brings storms and is dreadful, you can't do that. And you never kill a bird, and this from men who haven't necessarily read any Coleridge. And my friend Soren said, if you kill a bird, I knew a Turk who did that. There was a bird who was shitting on the forecastle, so he killed it, threw it into the sea, and the next day he lost an arm. And I thought, well, that's a good story, and it sounds like it's true, because after all, the guy didn't have an arm. So yeah, the language of superstition was wonderful. And then, of course, there's a visual language, which is all in tattoos, which we now copy on land. But, of course, where it came from was so that you could haul a seafarer out of the drink and read his life in his tattoos. And the same iconography still holds true. So sailing ship means you cross the Atlantic. Red Dragon was a Chinese port. How many others are there? There are loads. Gold Dragon was crossing the date line. Leatherback Turtle, I think, was crossing the equator, hence shellback. So yeah, they have this whole thing. And I'll just end, actually, with the final anecdote, which was my friend Chris sent me a picture, and he's quite a rotund boy. He's heading for captain now, man. And there was a picture of his nipples with what, this kind of lovebirds, one over each one. And, of course, they're actually supposed to be swallows, and a swallow is for 5,000 miles at sea. But a seafarer puts them on there, because if they die at sea, the birds will carry their spirit home.
I'm very interested in the ways that over the course of the sessions we've had, certain, to me, slightly unexpected themes are beginning to return in new guises each time. One of those is naming, which I suppose is perhaps not that unexpected, but keeps coming back in fascinating ways. What language can be used, can't be used, what agency it has. And perhaps in the next session with Nancy, we might talk a little about the problematics and virtues of this other word that keeps coming back, the Anthropocene, and what that name might mean and carry with it as an encoded politics. And the other is what's known in academia and beyond as TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, which is to say the forms of environmental thought and knowledge that are carried in folklore and traditional societies and indigenous cultures. And that, it seems to me, keeps returning, and I'm really looking forward to talking more about that with Nancy, who's thought very hard about these things. The phrase you used early on, and to me before the session, was radical optimism. And I wondered if you could give us a bit of that to end with, and whether a reading from some of the inspirational people working for change that you met while traveling following another bird would be a good way to end.
Yes, so I went to follow to tell the story of the disappearance of the slender-billed curlew, which was then the world's rarest bird, certainly the rarest bird in the Western Palearctic. And the slender-billed curlew had no confirmed sighting since 1999. Worldwide search, or sort of species migration route search by BirdLife International, no confirmed sightings. They have been seen. I've met bird watchers who know bird watchers and trust them, who've seen it. But of course, in the digital age, you have to have a clear photograph for the bird to exist. And luckily, this bird, in some ways exists beyond that edge. And what I thought was going to be a very sad story, the disappearance of a species, our misuse of water, the end of the littoral, liminal areas of marsh that it needed, turned into a very inspiring journey on the other hand, because it's about how much we can do. And this is, I think, probably my last thought, So I believe it's true that in the ice cores, the days after 9/11 are written in the absence of pollution in the air. So 2001, foot and mouth, the British countryside was closed, and suddenly bird species came back. In Finland, this accounts of the Civil War, where the most horrifying account was the cruelty of victorious whites to orphaned red children. Only a century ago last year. This year, Finnish children are the happiest, best balanced, least depressed in the world, and least anxious. So how much we can do, how incredibly powerful we are, how in fact, given the right people in power, everything can change in moments. It's not a slide downhill. And my story about slender-billed curlew was just that these amazing men, there was the first bird watcher in Greece, because under the colonels, there was no bird watching. Nobody knew what it was. And there's a guy in Bulgaria, Petar Yankov, who had statistics. He was taught by the RSPB how to gather data. So when Bulgaria joins the EU, they don't have any data, because they're on the Soviet Academy of Science model, where you just compile it all and don't know what it means. But BSPB had data, so in order to access EU funding, the Bulgarian government went to him and said to the bird watcher, can you do this for us? He said, I designated 30% of Bulgaria a specially protected zone, and it still is. So they have these amazing bird species. And
are they all men?
They were, actually. Handrinos, Yankov, and Janos Bertold-Kiss were all men. But you're talking perhaps, which is unusual under communism, because actually quite a lot of the time there was certainly intellectual and capable, but I guess not necessarily in Ceausescu's Romania. So the bit I was going to read to you isn't necessarily radically optimistic, but it does have something about it. And it was a ringtone on the Axios. So we're just near Thessalonica. And we're looking for the slender-billed curlew, but we know we're not going to find it. And he talks about how you can have symposia, you can eat, discuss, drink, have orgies. Anyone can have his opinion. The failure of an ecosystem may be initially driven by man, but the effects of other species, the butterfly effect, without the knowledge, there is no value in it if you cannot find the reason. We are in a time when everything starts from man, but we usually categorize things in terms of how we have to deal with them. It is very difficult to deal with this in terms of conservation measures. Conservation is about action, to do something or to reverse something, not just to act, not just to know, to act. If I can't act, it's just documentary, just information. And so we set off, and it's this wonderful environment. There were green shank and snake crossing the roads. And we could go through there, he says, but it's salt, and I'd have to wash the car. And I realise he's in love with his Fiat goat. So we dismount and put up the telescope and enter the delta evening. There's a lighthouse due south, and to the right of it, a low island with a pale structure. And this was Aphrodite's taverna, and they were an old couple, and she was called Aphrodite. It was perfect. However hot it was, there was always wind there, and never any mosquitoes. And you get there on a boardwalk, and you could stay until dusk, all night if there was a full moon. And we study curlews through the scope. And curlews in the collective noun in English is a herd, which kind of works. They look warm even when they're up to their thighs in cold water. And when large numbers take flight together, they fill the sky with a jumbled, untidy jumbling of cries and white rumps and flapping. Their music is the sound of all their habitats, of the marsh, the moor, and the sky, a hectic and melodious trilling, which gave them their English name. In French, it's even better. Corli, corli. In Greek, it's torlida, torlida. Yanis recalls hearing a cry like it, but unlike it, the call of the slender-billed mystery. It was like a shock. I was out birdwatching 3 years ago in early September. I was here, close to this roost of curlews. I have a slender-billed curlew ringtone. I heard exactly the same noise. I hear it every day. I hear it every time I get a text message. It's imprinted in my brain. I heard it, and I thought I'd received a message. And then I realized it was not a message. The phone was in the car. I went back for days, but nothing. He agrees to play the slender-billed curlew's cry from his phone. It takes him a while to find it, but then he does. It rises and rises, a burbling ache, a fluted whistle with lament and wildness and defiance in it, a sound for the whole evening, for time gone, for taboos crushed, for mystery, for Greece. Thank you very much indeed.